Okay, today, respiration. If by breath alone I can be a bigger man, how ephemeral. Okay, so back to Galen. Here's a little quote from him about the lungs. Blood passing through the lungs absorbed from the inhaled air the quality of coolness, which it then carried into the left end of the heart. So he thought that the reason we breathe was because our heart and our blood was this source of innate heat. We had fire in us that if it wasn't cooled would get out of control and catch on fire. And so we needed to breathe or else we would combust. And clearly this is not quite correct. But he did have some of the plumbing right here. He knew that the blood returning from the heart, returning from the lungs, went into the left side of the heart. So at least he had some of his wiring down. Leonardo, this quote here, the substance of the lung is dilatable and extensible, like the tinder made from a fungus. But it is spongy, and if you press it, it yields to the force which compresses it. And if the force is removed, it accreases again to its original size. So he was actually playing with little bits of lung here and noticing that it's like spongy. It's kind of like a sponge, and that's actually quite a good metaphor. A sponge, the reason that a sponge is able to absorb so much water is because it has a high surface area to volume. It has all these little pockets that when you squeeze it can fill up with air, high surface area to volume. And then much later, this guy Harvey, William Harvey, dapper dude that he was, he understood that some sort of nourishment, he didn't know what, but the body is getting something via the blood, and the lungs are providing it. He hadn't completely put the story together. So a quote from him is, life and respiration are complementary. There's nothing living which does not breathe, nor anything which is breathing which does not live. So to him, the breath there was some vital element in the breath, in the air that we were bringing in. And this goes along with the notions of phlogiston. We hadn't quite had the benefit of Lavoisier in France yet, and the understanding of oxygen and combustion quite. But he did understand that there was something in the air that wasn't just a coolness. We weren't just like cooling the body down. There was something there. Of course, it was oxygen. The modern practice of pulmonology happened in the 19th century. And this guy here, Osler, I've talked about him in the past. He started a field called physiology, not phys with an F, phys with a TH, but actually it's a PHTH. There's a diphthong for you. Physiology. And that was in response to the epidemic of consumption or tuberculosis. All right, and out of his efforts grew the American Lung Association, really interested in the prevention of tuberculosis. A lot of the early tuberculosis clinics, as they were trying to understand what was going on, because tuberculosis was ravaging Europe and the United States at the time, they thought that a lot of fresh air was what was needed. And so these clinics for tuberculosis, if you see any of the old ones, they are actually quite beautiful places to live. They're often in these mountainous, picturesque places, or like on a seashore or something like that, with like tons of windows. These old buildings with like nothing but windows all the time that were thrown open to encourage lots of fresh air for these people who would go there with tuberculosis. Tuberculosis, by the way, is one of the truly major health challenges of the coming century. Like the estimates are 1/3 of the global population has latent tuberculosis, so some sort of case of subclinical tuberculosis. It's a lot of people, man. It's a lot of folks. Going to have to be, and then antibiotic-resistant tuberculosis being the real trigger that will that could become a truly global pandemic. So another disease that really ran rampant across the world was polio, poliomyelitis, where the myelin is degraded from various nerves in the body, and the problem becoming that the phrenic nerve was demyelinated, and these people were not able to breathe any longer. For example, our president, Franklin Delano Roosevelt, had polio and was wheelchair bound because he lost use of his legs. But worse were all these young children that got polio and couldn't breathe. And to help them breathe, they developed these iron lungs right here. And these kids had to live in these negative pressure ventilators. Basically, it was a cuff that went around their neck, and there would be a vacuum pressure in the chamber, and it would like pull on their body and artificially extend their chest, and then a positive pressure would compress it, and it would help air go in and out of their lungs. They had to live. This was not like, oh, a treatment, you'll be better next week. This was their reality. There were whole wards. I mean, it's hard to wrap your head around this. And I guess I'm hitting this right now because I think this is particularly important because right now there's a ballot initiative on March 3rd here in the state of Maine asking whether there should be exemptions for vaccines in public schools in the state of Maine, right? Like we can send our kids to public school without having to have them vaccinated, right? And prior to vaccines, this kind of thing was common across America. It was great because at least the kids didn't die, right? Prior to this, there was just like astronomical infant mortality. But now we have these huge wards. Every major city had hospitals that had a whole floor dedicated to these negative pressure ventilators, where these people were consigned to a life of that, which seems horrifying to me, right? Vaccines work. They don't cause autism. Hopefully the state of Maine will come to terms with that. Anyways, yeah, in 1928, these iron lungs came out and actually saved the lives of a lot of young people. And then, thank God, Jonas Salk invented the vaccine. All right, enough history. The alveoli in your lungs are the location of gas exchange. I already talked about how they have such a high surface area in the lab. But in fact, they are 35 times the surface area of the body. That's like the surface area of a sperm whale. The surface area of a sperm whale could be condensed down and fit into your lungs. That's pretty incredible. It's pretty incredible. All right, so today I'm going to talk about, briefly remind you of what we talked about in lab, the respiratory anatomy, with a little detour into asthma and COPD. Then a slide or two about how we ventilate, talking about how we move the air to and from the surface, gas exchange, and then I'll switch to internal respiration. So that's all external respiration, the ventilation and gas exchange. Internal respiration, transport, is the job of hemoglobin, and we'll spend the bulk of the lecture on hemoglobin dynamics. and a little bit of carbon dioxide transport. If I have time at the end, I'll talk about some don't smoke or vape. All right, the anatomy and its corresponding functions. So the upper respiratory system up in the nasal cavity, the job of that is, first of all, to sort of sample, to like filter out any kind of suspended particles in the air, but also as it does that, sample it and provide sensory information in terms of olfaction, your ability to smell. As we descend at the boundary between the upper and lower respiratory system, we have phonation, which is the job of the larynx, and the mucociliary escalator, we'll talk about in a moment. It is responsible for protecting the respiratory surfaces, gas exchange in the alveoli of the lungs, and then the diaphragm and the associated musculature is responsible for the ventilation, moving the air to and from the gas exchange surfaces. So those are the components, the functional components of the respiratory system. Starting at the top, we have a cross-section of Jean-Luc Picard's face, and you can see there in the nasal cavity that these nasal concha, these turbinates, they do create turbulence in the air, which encourages odorant particles to adhere to the walls of the nasal cavity, facilitating both the filtration and the olfaction. I should put a picture. I've always meant to. I always forget to do it. I want to get a picture of a similar cross-section of like a dog and a cross-section of a seal. Seal has one of the most far-out nasal cavities you've ever seen, like hundreds of these little curlicues up in there. It's incredible. I mean, they use it to be able to smell fish from miles away in the ocean, but we don't have such a high demand on our sense of smell. Okay, descending, looking at the surface of the epithelium in the respiratory system, we see that there are these ciliated epithelium. So there are these epithelial cells with these long, like finger-like projections, these hairs. And they're part of the mucus elevator, the mucociliary elevator. It helps to adhere particles, so the mucus that's on the surface, the inhaled particles adhere to it, and then the little fingers wave it upwards and help you to expectorate it. It's also a high surface area, so that it is able to radiate heat and warm the air that you're inhaling. Contrary to what Galen thought, we actually want a little bit warmer air, not colder air in the lungs. Cold air can actually potentiate asthmatic fits. Okay. So here's a little bit more of a diagrammatic picture of it. And on the left there, you see the columnar epithelium with the mucus and the chunks of God knows what grumus that you were breathing in adhered to the mucus and then charmingly being lifted towards the larynx where you're going to hack it up, whatever that thing was that you inhaled. All that mucus is being produced by these mucus cells, goblet cells, so-called goblet cells that live in that epithelial lining. All right. So here's some more pictures of them, and this is kind of interesting because you can see both the ciliated columnar epithelium, but then you see these goblet cells here that are exocytosing little packets of mucus onto the surface, and it's this sort of mucociliary escalator that's working this stuff upwards. All right. On down to the lungs. So here's what the lungs do. Most people, like my second grade daughter, would be able to tell you that your lungs are for gas exchange, breathing. You bring oxygen in and carbon dioxide out. But they have a number of other functions. Because they're eliminating carbon dioxide from the blood, that has profound impacts on the pH of your blood. So it's regulating acid-base balance. There are these white blood cells that live in the lungs. And because you can think of the lungs that, even though they're inside of you, it's really an external surface. And because of that, it's one point of contact with pathogens. In fact, a really important point of contact because it's 35 times the surface area of your body, and because you're constantly actively moving air to and from this surface, the lungs are an important point of contact with pathogens, arguably the most vulnerable point of contact of pathogens. Because of that, they're richly invested with white blood cells and that make antibodies. We also have eosinophils there. So, for example, well, I'll leave that. Because of their high surface area, there's capillaries all through that whole surface area. The lungs are full of blood, full of it. Like 20% of your blood volume is in your lungs. That's a lot. That's a lot. And if you actually think about that, that's kind of interesting, right? Because that means 20% of your blood at any one time is in the pulmonary circuit, whereas 80% is in the systemic circuit. So you'd imagine that your average blood cell spends about 20% of its time. It takes, or I guess the way to think about it, it takes 4 times as long to move through the systemic circuit as it takes to move through the pulmonary circuit for a red blood cell. It's another way to think about it. And then lastly, this is a lesser appreciated but no less important function of the lungs. They have endocrine function. They are the site of formation. They produce leukotrienes, which are pro-inflammatory cytokines. They also have the endocrine function of activating angiotensin. We'll talk about angiotensin when we talk about the kidneys and blood pressure. And then it's also the breakdown of a number of different hormones in the body, such as epinephrine, like when the werewolf senator comes in the room screaming, and you get that boost of epinephrine. When that recedes, it's the lungs that are turning that over, as well as serotonin. So this is, I don't know, most of this is from the lab. Yeah.
What did you say the function of leukotrienes were?
They're just pro-inflammatory cytokines. It's just like a hormone that's going to get the immune cells moving. Yeah. And it's like leukotrienes are a class of molecule. And the important thing, I guess, on this slide is this little bit down here. So I'm showing you the medium bronchi. Each of those segments are highlighted in different colors in that bronchial tree on the left. And this is the primary site of resistance, of ventilatory resistance. Your autonomic nervous system and any kind of thing that you might inhale that is an irritant, like smoke or dust or, I don't know, whatever, some kind of irritant to the lungs, is going to alter that resistance. And so when I talk about resistance, when you inhale air, it's not you feel the pressure of inhaling it, right? That primary resistance, like whether it's harder or easier to inhale, is happening at this sort of mid-level bronchi, not at the terminal, and not up in the secondary and tertiary bronchi, and these mid-level bronchi. That's where most of the resistance. So if you were looking at a cross-sectional area going through this tree, the highest variability is going to be here at these medium bronchi, and we can control that diameter either bronchodilation, which means an opening of the bronchi, a widening of the lumen. That is driven by the sympathetic nervous system, and things like epinephrine are also going to drive that. And then, on the other hand, there's bronchoconstriction, which is a narrowing of the air passage, and that's going to increase resistance, make it harder to breathe. All right, so that's driven by the parasympathetic nervous system. And that, you'd be like, well, why don't you always just have it real big, right? Isn't that what you want? Well, no, you sleep sometimes. You do sleep, and there needs to be some sort of a balance between your respiratory regulatory mechanism that is like getting ventilation while you sleep and the amount of oxygen that's actually required at that time, etc. All right, when those bronchioles can become inflamed, we call that bronchitis. I'm sure everybody here, maybe even everybody within the span of this month, maybe has experienced this. At least some of us have. This is where we have an inflammation and bronchoconstriction. If there's a chronic inflammation of some sort in the wall of the bronchiole, where that mucosal lining is inflamed and thickened, and the smooth muscle is always overdriven and it's been constricted, then we get a real narrowing of that passageway. If it happens chronically because you've been exposing yourself to some kind of irritant like cigarette smoke, then you get chronic occlusive pulmonary disease, COPD. And there are 10 million people in the United States have that. 40,000 people a year die just because of COPD, not lung cancer, just because they basically suffocate. They'll be at home, they'll have a real acute attack of COPD and cannot ventilate properly and suffocate. Asthma is an atopic inflammation of the bronchial mucosa. So atopic disease is disease that is basically, you can think of it as allergic disease. Allergy in general is an inflammation of any surface that is going to come in contact with the outside world. So for example, you have atopic dermatitis on your skin, you have atopic rhinitis or hay fever in your nose. You can have atopic oculitis, like inflamed eyes. You can have asthma, that's atopically driven. You can even have like atopic manifestation in the gut because of something that you ate that is passing through. So all these surfaces that come in contact with the outside world. And in general, atopic disease is mediated by helper T cells, Th2 cells. And it's like the mechanism that your body's developed for dealing with parasites, right? So we have viruses and bacteria on one hand and parasites on the other. And that mechanism, in the Western world, parasites are not very common any longer. But that machinery is still there, and it can lead to these atopic manifestations, which are characterized by this inflammatory process. They make steroids that can control it, and then there's these beta adrenergic agonists that act as bronchodilators. Albuterol is the primary inhaler that you see people with asthma taking. All right. Your pulmonary blood pressure is pretty low. It's pretty low, right? The mean pressure in the pulmonary circuit is about 30 millimeters of mercury. And everybody calculated their mean arterial pressure the other day. Most of the class is, around like 80 or something like that, 90. So it's about 3 times as high, or it's about a third of that in the pulmonary circuit. Because it's so low pressure, the pulmonary circuit is really prone to what's called a pulmonary embolism. So a pulmonary vessel can get blocked. There can be an occlusion, from like a clot that can get thrown off. Maybe the clot formed because of a PFO, the patent foramen ovale in the heart, or maybe a little wad of fat or an air bubble or something like that. You can get a pulmonary embolism. And so that's what is being depicted here and here. Huh? No. This is the pulmonary trunk. This is the pulmonary arteries, and here are the occlusive emboli. All right. So these are actually better pictures than I have in the lab. We can see here, this is the respiratory tissue, all these alveoli all over the place, alveolar duct ending in alveolar sac, and branches off the alveolar sac are the alveoli. So gas exchange starts in the respiratory bronchioles, and you can see at the top of the panel on the left, the respiratory bronchiole. It's a bronchiole, but it has a alveoli off of it. So right there would be an alveoli coming off of that respiratory bronchiole. That's where we begin to exchange gas, and as we move down, more and more alveoli present themselves. So here's a cartoon showing what it looks like. All these alveoli, and there are a couple different types of cells that are involved here. The first is simply a pneumocyte type 1. It is a layer of simple squamous epithelium. So squamous meaning squashed, simple meaning single layer. Simple squamous epithelium that is lining the inside of all of these. Then there are these in the walls, or the so-called septum, between adjacent alveoli. There are these type 2 pneumocytes, pneumo meaning lung, cyte cell, pneumocyte, these septal cells, which produce this surfactant. And the surfactant is an oily secretion that's made of phospholipids, proteins, etc. And a surfactant is something that is going to be amphipathic. It's going to have both an oily and a nonpolar and a polar part to them. Why do you think the body makes this stuff, the DPCC, the dipalmitoylphosphatidylcholine? Anyone want to guess why we want a surfactant? Reduce the surface tension of water. Yeah. Oh yeah, of course. Yeah, obviously, that's it for sure. Because if we need these surfaces to be moist. You can't have your lungs dry out. That sounds bad. But water has a high surface tension, and it'll form little droplets, right? And if you have a giant droplet, the gas would have to dissolve into the droplet, through the droplet, to get to the surface below it. So we have a surfactant which keeps the layer of moisture on the lungs very, very thin so that it can speed gas exchange. All right. So here is the respiratory membrane. Looking closely at the wall between a capillary and the inside of an alveolar airspace, that membrane that separates the two of them is about half a micron, so 0.5 micrometers. That, just to put that into context, is 2/100,000ths of an inch. That is super thin, folks. That is a really thin space. So the message here being that alveoli are actually very delicate structures that are easily damaged when you do something stupid like vape, carpet cleaner, cherry flavored carpet cleaner or something like that from some bootleg vape site online. I'm just sounding like an old curmudgeon there. Okay, so let's look at this membrane. We have the squamous epithelial cell right there. We're going to have some basement membrane, which then gets fused to the capillary epithelium. And a red blood cell is going to be in the lumen of the capillary. So all air has to do is diffuse right across that membrane, and there's a red blood cell. Very short trip. So here is an overview of respiration. There's, in general, two regions. There's external respiration and internal respiration. External respiration, we can break it down into three parts. Ventilation, pulmonary ventilation, getting air to and from the surfaces. Then there's the gas exchange across that membrane. And then there's transport to the cells. Once we get it to the cells, then we have internal respiration. This is like our cells actually burning the oxygen, right? Actually burning the fuel. We won't talk about that today. That will be something fun that we'll leave for the end of the week. So, if you have any kind of abnormality in your external respiration, it can be dangerous. Here are some terms for you. Hypoxia. Hypoxia is a low tissue level of oxygen. Anoxia is no oxygen in the tissue. Apnea is a temporary cessation of breathing, particularly during sleep. So sleep apnea is, like that kind of thing. People stop. Yeah, hey.
Isn't anoxia a sign of sepsis?
There are going to be a lot of reasons why tissue is anoxic. There can be, ischemia because there's like some sort of vascular blockage. It can be some kind of occlusion. Maybe there's sepsis and the tissue is breaking down. And there's like
But it's temporary. If we observe it over a really big amount of time, isn't the sign of the necrosis of a particular tissue?
necrosis of a tissue. Yeah, necrotic tissue is going to be anoxic for sure. Like chicken or the egg, like why did the tissue become anoxic? If it becomes anoxic, it's going to become necrotic and it can become septic, right? Some physics, Star Wars and physics together. Boyles Law. one little component of the ideal gas law. Are there any woodsmen in here? Hey. Boyles Law is that pressure is inversely related to volume in a space. And the way you can remember that is like Star Wars here. When Han and Leia and Luke were in the trash compactor, the volume was going down, but their pressure was going up, right? They were getting more and more concerned. And then you take Luke out here, home on the open range, huge volume, very low pressure, chilling. Listen to the Eagles back then in 1970. What was it, 7, 8? Yeah, okay. So that's how the lungs work, though. This is the physics behind how the lungs work. We change the volume of the thoracic cavity where the lungs are, and as we increase that volume, going, like pulling the diaphragm down and lifting the rib cage up and out, as we do that, it decreases the pressure in the lungs relative to atmospheric pressure, and so air rushes in. And then when we clamp down on the lungs, push on the lungs to exhale, the volume goes down, so the pressure goes up relative to the air outside, and it pushes the air out. Right? Boyles Law. Thank you for that. And I don't know, just a little bit of like yoga propaganda for you guys, because I'm a yogi. Wednesdays, 5:30, downtown door, Ashtanga, Namaste, all that. Anyways, there is, and I think I showed you this a little bit in the lab. There is, so breath starts at the pelvic diaphragm, that connective tissue sheet that defines the superior margin of the pelvic bowl. So breath starts by pressing down there, softening the belly, making room in the abdomen, essentially, so that then the thoracic diaphragm can come down and we can open up the lungs. Right? So it's like pressure down, outwards, and then extension of the lungs. All right. So here's gas exchange, right? This is how gas exchange works. To understand gas exchange, we got to talk about the partial pressures of certain gases in the atmosphere and in our lungs. In the world at large, in the air that we breathe, the partial pressure of oxygen is about 100 torr, right? So atmospheric pressure is what is it, 760 millimeters of mercury? 100 of that is because of the oxygen in the air. Most of it's because of the nitrogen. But 100 millimeters of mercury is because of the oxygen, and about 40 millimeters of mercury is because of the carbon dioxide in the air. So when we breathe in, we're breathing in air that is got about 100 millimeters of mercury, oxygen, and 40 of carbon dioxide. The blood that's coming to the lungs through the pulmonary trunk and all that, the blood that's coming to the lungs has a partial pressure of oxygen that is itself only 40. And the partial pressure of carbon dioxide is about 45. So there's this gradient that happens. There's a concentration gradient. There's a much higher pressure of oxygen in the air than in our blood, so oxygen will diffuse down its gradient into the blood. And carbon dioxide, there's a slight gradient outward, 45 in the blood, 40 in the air, so we will blow off some of the carbon dioxide. Such that now the blood leaving this respiratory membrane is going to be reflective of the partial pressures of those two gases in the atmosphere. Now, let's go to the other side, the peripheral tissue, wherever, down here in this guy's legs or something. the oxygen coming in is more or less, or the blood coming in has the same partial pressures, more or less, as the outside air. This is oxygenated blood. But the tissues have this 40 and 45 partial pressure of oxygen and carbon dioxide. So we get gas exchange again, where the oxygen diffuses out of the blood into the tissue down its concentration gradient, and carbon dioxide flows into the blood also down its concentration gradient, but in the opposite direction. Pretty straightforward. Yeah. Okay, everyone good? What does that transporting? Well, it's hemoglobin. I've shown you a picture of hemoglobin. And hemoglobin is a globular protein with quaternary structure. So there are 4 subunits to it. And each of those subunits has a porphyrin ring with an iron in it. The porphyrin ring with an iron in it is what we call a heme molecule. Iron likes to bind oxygen. As we know here's a model of hemoglobin left outside. The iron oxidizes, right? The iron is going to oxidize, turn to rust. Each red blood cell has 280 million hemoglobins in it. That is crazy amount of hemoglobin. That's a lot of that protein. Each red blood cell. Pretty amazing. So for the next, I guess I got a half hour. I'm going to, or no, I got 40 minutes. I'm going to talk about how hemoglobin works. So in the left panel, we're looking in the plane of the porphyrin ring, in the plane of actually the heme, right? Because the iron is coordinated in the center of that porphyrin ring. And the coordination chemistry, the geometry of the way that the iron can coordinate with things around it, combined with atoms around it, it is attached to this histine. So in deoxyhemoglobin, that histidine kind of pulls down on it a little bit. And we can see that this iron is down out of the plane. It's like imagine this being like a trampoline, like the membrane of a trampoline, and somebody's pulling down. Somehow they have like a rope that's attached to the middle of the trampoline. They're pulling down on it a little bit, okay? However, the iron is able to bind oxygen, and it's able to do that. It's particularly stabilized by, it's called resonance stabilization. Are there organic chemistry students in here? A couple of you? Good. Well, for those who haven't had organic chemistry yet, the take-home message is that a bond is going to be, some molecular configuration is going to be more favored if there are multiple ways that you can arrange the electrons, right? And we call that resonance. If there are multiple ways you can arrange the electrons will kind of go back and forth between them, and the overall structure is going to be some sort of average of these different ways that the electrons can arrange themselves. The binding of oxygen, diatomic oxygen, O2, to iron is resonance stabilized and changes the oxidation state of the iron. All right, it changes the oxidation state of the iron. One of the oxygens on Fe2+ is able to go up and be held by the oxygen because the oxygen's electronegative. It likes to hold electron density, so we get this superoxide ion. When that happens, a couple things happen. First of all, because we've changed the oxidation state of the iron, we've taken an electron out of the valence shell of the iron. The iron's a little bit smaller. It's just a little smaller than it was before. It didn't have as many electrons in there. And so it like kind of fits up in that porphyrin ring a little better. Secondly, there's this mass effect of having oxygen waving around on the other side of this trampoline. So it also pulls the iron upwards into plane. Right? So the geometry of this is a little different than this. Only 4 angstroms off. Only 4 angstroms off. That seems like so little. So little. But life depends on it. Life depends on 4.4, not even 4, 0.4 angstroms. It's like less than an atomic radii. That's amazing. It's amazing, but it's what enables hemoglobin to work. And you're saying, like, who cares? What is that? We're going to talk about that. What's up?
How do they even like measure that? How do they know it's 0.4?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, they're getting like X-ray crystal structures of this stuff with 0.1 angstrom resolution. Like they can get like pretty high. They're like they can get pretty high resolution structures nowadays. It is. It really is. So. Enter the concept of allosteria. Now, this is an important concept because the idea behind allosteria is that the ability of a protein to do its job, or specifically in this case, the activity of the hemoglobin and its ability to bind oxygen, is going to be affected by how much it's already done that. All right? So, definition, I have it written down here. Alteration of the activity of a protein through the binding of an effector molecule at a specific site. So you can change how well a protein does its job by the binding of an effector molecule. It's going to change how well the job gets done. And when we look at deoxyhemoglobin and compare it to oxyhemoglobin, where all 4 of the subunits each has an oxygen bound to them, that like 0.4 angstrom shift in the orientation of the porphyrin ring translates into a 15-degree rotation along the axis of the hemoglobin. The hemoglobin kind of dials into itself just a little bit. It's like the butterfly effect, the molecular butterfly effect. This like tiny little change in the shape of the porphyrin ring gets amplified through the molecular structure of the hemoglobin. All right. It is this shift in shape that happens that is going to affect the ability of hemoglobin to bind oxygen. So here are a couple GIFs I have, and we can see here that it's just sort of showing, this is like high speed, this is a little slower. It's just showing the difference between the oxy and the deoxy hemoglobin, the difference in the shape of the two proteins. So there are 4 binding sites for oxygen. Information about the status at one site, like whether oxygen has bound at one porphyrin ring, gets translated or transmitted through the molecular framework to another site. All right, and it's going to change the ability of oxygen to bind at another site in any of the 3 other sites that are open in the hemoglobin molecule. All right, this is cooperativity. That the binding that's happening at one site in a molecule is cooperatively affecting the ability of a molecule to bind at another site in the molecule. Is that capiche, everybody? Yeah.
So the oxygen molecules are essentially binding to the heme molecule, to the iron.
Yep.
How how does the entire chain system changes according to that addition?
I mean, how does the whole overall protein structure?
I just thought that like I'm thinking about how to divide the protein in 4 parts.
Yep.
And I'm just asking about how the addition of one oxygenated molecule in one of the parts of the heme
Yeah.
molecule of that part sends information to the other part.
Yeah.
Through
So,
the chain.
so imagine you have this system where, like, you're building the Eiffel Tower or something, right? And I have the 4 corners of it, right? And I'm going to take one of the bars at the bottom. I'm just going to move it a little bit. But it moves it a little bit, and it torques on this bar that's over here, and it makes that bend. But this bend affects both of these bars, which also bend a little bit more. And those bars bent quite a bit, and they bend a lot more. And so, like, just by moving the one bar at the bottom, I've thrown off the whole structure of the Eiffel Tower. And, like, the tip of the tower, even though I only moved the leg a little bit, the tip is, like, pointing way off in some other direction now. Does that make sense?
And all that is done by chemical chain.
Yeah, chemical bonds. So imagine, yeah, you're just like, you know, if I had some sort of thing here, this structure, and this is where the oxygen is, I'm gonna, you know, cause a little change in the position of this one. Look at the end of the stick in the other direction. You know, it gets a radical shift, and so the shift in structure of one of the subunits, they interact with the other subunits, and it changes the orientation of the other subunit, which then affects the position, the relative position of the porphyrin ring in each of the other subunits. Does that make sense? Yeah, super elegant system here, like unbelievable. Hemoglobin is like staggering. Yeah, staggering bit of machinery. Okay, so this is the probably most important slide to understand in terms of really getting what's going on here. This is a hemoglobin saturation dynamic curve. So if there was not this allosteria, if there was not this, I'm still cold, this communication of structure throughout throughout the structure of the hemoglobin, then this line here wouldn't be this S curve. It would be a normal saturation curve. But we have this weird sigmoidal curve. All right, this strange sigmoidal curve that is super important for hemoglobin. It reinforces hemoglobin's ability to exchange gas. All right, so let's see how it works. Let's start down here at 0 torr. There's no oxygen around, so all 4 of the sites, alpha, there's 2 alpha and 2 beta, they're all empty. And then let's go up here and go to 25% saturation. At 25% saturation, right about here, we're at about 18 torr. So at about 18 torr, 25% of the sites get saturated. At 50%, that is at around 28 torr. You guys see that? And then at 75, we're at 40 torr. It turns out that 40 torr is the concentration of oxygen at your cells, at the peripheral tissue. So even at the peripheral tissue, 75% of the available cell binding spots for oxygen are filled with oxygen. All right? Your hemoglobin is 75% saturated at your cells. Then, at 100% saturation, that happens at around, conveniently, 100 torr, which is the concentration of oxygen in your lungs, in the outside air. Right? So when we're breathing, we're really just going from here to here and back and forth. We're on this part of the curve up there, going from our veins down to the cells over to the lungs. Yes?
So like when you put a pulse ox on your finger and it says like 90 to 98% SpO2, that's like what that's measuring, right?
Exactly.
Okay.
Yeah.
So like your blood generally, you want it to be in like 100 torr range equal to your lungs, correct?
Yeah. You want when that pulse oximeter that goes on your finger, that when it says 98, it's not measuring torr, it's measuring percent
Right.
saturation.
Which equates to like
Similar to it, but it's not a linear thing. It's not linear. Yeah.
Do we like just ignore everything pre-40 or?
Dude, it's like I paid you before class to ask that question. So let me just flip it on you and say, what the hell? Why are we doing this? Why are we carting around 3 oxygen molecules all the time that are never coming off the cells? What do you think, bright, eager young minds? Why? Okay, I'm just going to sit and... Oh, yeah, Charlie.
Well, it says that the systemic tissue's at rest, so if the tissues are being used, is it lower?
It can go lower. Absolutely, it can go lower. That's right. He's it. Keep working that thought.
Like if a muscle tissue needs oxygen, then I guess it could probably fly off a couple more.
Yeah, and look at the relative slope of those curves. Right? Look at the relative slope of this curve versus the relative slope of that curve. What do you notice? Yeah.
One is really like the slope gradient of the one before 40 door is really high, while the other one is really low.
So for a small change in pressure below 40, we have a significant mobilization of a significant decrease in saturation, a significant mobilization of oxygen reserves. You see that? Whereas up here, we're just moving oxygen, This is like strategic oxygen reserves, right? It's like strategic oxygen reserves in case we need it. It's like oil, right? How many billions of barrels of oil does the U.S. have just sitting around, not doing anything? It's the strategic reserve. So, it's a perfectly timed question, Leon. Thank you. At rest, we're moving about 21% of our oxygen supply. However, when we start working out and we need more oxygen, and that partial pressure of oxygen really drops at the peripheral cells, we can now mobilize for a change. So between 40 and 100 torr, we're shifting 60 millimeters of mercury of oxygen, but we're only getting 21% of the oxygen saturation for that. But here, for only 20 millimeters change, we're getting 45 additional percentage points. All right? So in strenuous exercise, you're actually using about 2/3 of the oxygen that you have on the hemoglobin. It's pretty convenient. All right. So there are like a couple different models for how this works. All right. There's this concerted model where everything changes in a sort of smooth way. There's this sequential model, but they're both based on this concept of the T state and the R state. The T state, the tense state, is one in which the hemoglobin does not want to bind oxygen. It's tense. It does not want to bind oxygen. No, no, stay away, oxygen. And then there's the relaxed state. Sure, I'll bind oxygen. Come on over. I'm in a relaxed state. I'm ready to bind. I'm cool. All right. So we're gonna see how that plays out in the next slide. But the essential idea here is that when there is no oxygen bound, the body favors the T state. When there's no oxygen attached to the hemoglobin, the shape of the hemoglobin favors this tense state, the T state. In that state, the hemoglobin doesn't want to bind oxygen. It's hard to bind oxygen. All right? So if there is no oxygen bound, then it's really hard to bind oxygen. If there is oxygen bound, then it is really easy to bind more oxygen. Its ability to bind oxygen or not varies in direct proportionality to whether it is or isn't binding. This should make sense because right here in the T state, you're down at the peripheral tissues. You don't want to bind oxygen down in the peripheral tissues. You want to unload oxygen. So when there's low saturation, the lower the saturation gets, the harder it is to bind. The higher the saturation there is, the easier it is to bind oxygen. That's going to be at the lungs. That's what you want. Oxygen is more favorable. Our state is more favorably preferred at the lungs when there's high oxygen around. So let's look at this. If you had some kind of like magical hemoglobin that was always in this R state, always in the conformation because of the porphyrin ring and the shifting around, if it was always in the R state and never changed to this T state, like oxygen binds and it didn't change its shape at all, this is what the binding curve would look like right here. This would be R state binding curve. Always like open to binding oxygen in this R state. If it was stuck, frozen in the T state, this is what the binding curve would look like. We get this, all right? We get this. And so one of the things about, we can change the look of this purple curve. Our body can change the look of this purple curve using different effectors that are going to prefer the R state or the T state. All right, and we can shift the curve to look more like one or the other to suit the needs of the moment. And we'll see what that means in a bit. But R state binding curve, relaxed, meaning it wants to bind oxygen, right? For very low partial pressure of oxygen, you get high saturation. Versus a T state for a very high concentration of oxygen, you get a very low saturation. Yeah.
Do you have like a graph of this, like graphed against time, just to see like how it changes over time based on like the change in saturation? Are there graphs like that? I'm just like curious to see like how it like creates like a.
Mean so like the actual observed curve, the purple curve.
Yeah.
Yeah. The purple curve. I don't have, there's probably something on there, but what we need to do is add the effector. I haven't shown you any effectors yet that favor the R state or the T state. Yeah, what's up? Oh, you're just scratching yourself. Yeah, okay. Here we go. Hello, 2,3-bisphosphoglycerate. In the presence of 2,3-bisphosphoglycerate, it stabilizes the T state. It stabilizes this I don't want to bind oxygen state. 2,3 bisphosphoglycerate. Right? So in the presence of 2,3-bisphosphoglycerate, when we are exercising, we get 66% transfer. If we didn't have 2,3-bisphosphoglycerate, it actually, the curve would be only about 8% oxygen transfer when you were exercising, because this is the 20% saturation, the 20% torr that would happen when your muscles are really working, right? So this 2,3-bisphosphoglycerate has to be present for our curve to actually look like this red thing. It comes closer to the T state. We'll see why this even is this way at all. Turns out that 2,3-bisphosphoglycerate is a metabolic intermediate in cells that are burning sugar. Cells that are burning sugar, glucose. We're going to break glucose down through the central metabolism. It goes down through the glycolytic pathway, gets broken down to 1,3-bisphosphoglycerate, 1,3-BPG. That's a 3-carbon sugar. So we've taken a 6-carbon molecule, broken it in half. We get a couple 1,3-bisphosphoglycerates. We phosphorylated it, whatever. And normally, 1,3-bisphosphoglycerate gets converted to 3-phosphoglycerate by this kinase that's going to rip one of the phosphoryl groups off of it, and then that becomes, through some steps, pyruvate, which then becomes acetyl-CoA, goes into the mitochondria, makes ATP, blah, blah, blah. So this is like some painful step in the middle of glycolysis, breaking sugar down to pyruvate, so we can get some energy out of it. But when there is a low pH, when there's a lot of acid around in the cell, right? Specifically what? Like lactic acid in a muscle. When a muscle starts to really get tired and produce lactic acid, the acidic conditions favor the activity of this enzyme. It enables this enzyme here to work, this bisphosphoglycerate mutase. And it inhibits this other enzyme called 2,3-bisphosphoglycerate phosphatase. So ignore all of this for a moment. There's these two enzymes that take bisphosphoglycerate and instead of going directly to 3-phosphoglycerate, are able to go through this intermediate 2,3-bisphosphoglycerate. But this secondary path gets favored when you're at low pH, right? When the muscles are overworking. When the muscles are overworking, this secondary path gets favored where this enzyme goes up in its activity, and the secondary enzyme that takes us out of this pathway, the 3-phosphoglycerate, actually gets slowed down, so we get an accumulation of 2,3-bisphosphoglycerate, the 2,3-BPG. So when a muscle is like working it, gets acidic, it gets hypoxic, it's going down in oxygen, so we're down around 20 torr, and we accumulate this 2,3-bisphosphoglycerate, which is going to make us look more like this curve right here and enable us to dump more oxygen at that lower partial pressure of oxygen. All right, so let's see how this works. It gets cooler, too. It just keeps getting cooler. There's this binding pocket. This binding pocket, it's like the donut hole. 2,3-BPG is like the donut hole in the hemoglobin donut. Hemoglobin is like a giant donut. There's a hole in the middle, and it's a binding pocket. Stuff can get stuck in there because hemoglobin itself is able to dial down on itself, right? It rotates, that 15-degree rotation affects the size of that binding pocket. So when you jam 2,3-bisphosphoglycerate in there, it's going to stabilize that T state. It's going to prevent those conformational shifts that happen when hemoglobin binds oxygen. So like if we bound oxygen here and it gets translated through the whole system by all the bonds, right? And where this site binding oxygen is going to affect the binding of oxygen at the other sites. But if we stick something in here, like wedge a chunk of wood in the door, it's going to prevent the hemoglobin molecule from doing that rotation, and it's going to prevent the transfer of information, structural information throughout the molecule. Not completely, but it stabilizes the T state. However, in fetal hemoglobin, this is important now. This is where it gets interesting. Yeah.
Wait, before we go, I'm confused. So it prevents conformational change, but like.
It like inhibits it, not completely, but it stabilizes the T state.
But don't you want the conformational change because that's what binds the oxygen?
Yeah. So when you are at the cells, the peripheral tissue, saturation is low, blood oxygen partial pressure is low, right? We don't want hemoglobin binding oxygen. If there's any oxygen bound to it, we want it to jump off. We don't want oxygen bound at the tissue where all this 2,3-bisphosphoglycerate is, right? If the cells are really like pumping out, we want to like unload as much of that reserve as possible. Does that make sense?
Yeah.
Yeah. Okay. So in fetal hemoglobin, there is in the beta subunits, they're not actually called beta, they're called gamma. I should change that to gamma. The gamma subunits in fetal hemoglobin, this histidine is actually, these two histidines have become serines. And because of that, it changes that 2,3-BPG binding pocket such that 2,3-BPG does not fit in there as well. It's going to look more like the R state than the T state. It's not going to stabilize the T state as well as it did in normal hemoglobin or adult hemoglobin. Does that make sense? Yeah. That's going to have consequences for what happens in utero. So here's mom's hemoglobin, and here's baby's hemoglobin. We have mom's hemoglobin has 2 alpha subunits, 2 beta subunits, does what it does. We have 2 alpha and 2 gamma subunits. Because of this, at any particular partial pressure of oxygen, okay, at this partial pressure of oxygen, the baby has way higher affinity for that oxygen than the mother does. The mom does, so oxygen is going to flow from the mother to the baby. All right? The baby, the fetal hemoglobin rips the oxygen off of the maternal hemoglobin and sticks it on its own hemoglobin. It's because of a change in the binding pocket of 2,3-BPG in gamma hemoglobin, in fetal hemoglobin. So, right, I mean, and here's the story I've already told you about, right? The shift in fetal circulation. Blood is coming in through the placental artery, goes in from the placenta up the umbilical vein, goes to through the liver, enters the inferior vena cava, goes into the right atrium, and then that blood gets shunted both through the ductus arteriosus out of the pulmonary trunk and through the foramen ovale. So all that oxygenated blood basically skips the pulmonary circuit by and large, and then comes right down and gets distributed throughout the body. All right. So what is the point? What am I trying to get here? Yeah, I guess This is just showing you there's more than just one. There's this embryonic hemoglobin that goes down with time. This is just showing you the time course of the presence of these different hemoglobins. So right at birth, you see that the fetal hemoglobin takes a nosedive. We stop producing it, and we start producing tons of this beta chain hemoglobin. All right. So at birth, it's like such a radical time in your life. It's such a radical time in your life. Your whole circulatory system switches over. We're going to go through thymic deletion. And now we got to flip over all of our hemoglobin from being the gamma hemoglobin to being beta hemoglobin. When that happens, this is going to lead us into talking about hemoglobin recycling. So a red blood cell lives from like 120 to 180 days in your circulatory system. It begins to get broken down and get separated into the globulin protein that's going to get just digested, and then the heme molecule. Heme can have the iron ripped off of it and gets shuttled around through some protein called transferrin. But then the porphyrin ring of the heme gets converted into biliverdin, which is one of the bile salts. That then gets converted into bilirubin, verdin meaning green, rubin meaning red. Bilirubin also goes to the liver and then gets exported, can get turned into the bile salts for absorption of fat, but can also get released in the excreta. So bilirubin is actually what makes our feces brown. All right, it's what makes our feces brown. In babies, because they're turning over so much hemoglobin so rapidly, sometimes the rise of the rise of beta is not commensurate with the decline of gamma. And because of that, there's an overabundance of bilirubin in the blood. Like back here, if these two things the dynamics of these two aren't perfectly matched up, and we're unloading gamma faster than we're gaining beta, we get this newborn jaundice. All right, because there's like a whole bunch of bilirubin in the blood. And this is like a normal thing. It's a normal thing. About 60% of the healthy babies have this in the first few weeks of life, this thing. And it turns out that it is easily treated with exposure to a little bit of short wavelength UV phototherapy. Helps that process of rolling over the bilirubin. Or if you don't want to stick your baby in a tanning bed, you can also just expose it to some mild sunlight. Early morning, like before 10 a.m., that like early morning light up till like 10:30. Baby can just sit naked in the sun. Not going to get a sunburn. Yeah. I remember fondly remember sitting with my newborn daughter, who was yellow, looked a little bit like a lemon, in the sun. We lived in Texas. And sit in the morning with her on my lap out on the porch. It was so fun. Just like naked baby zoning out in the sun. All right, let's keep going. Couple more concepts before I cut you loose here. 2,3-BPG is not the only thing that can affect the T state, R state balance. There's a number of them. For example, pH also does. pH also does this. So we know that the blood pH should be about 7.4, but if it gets more acidic, it heads towards the T state. That should make sense because if you if your blood is acidic, it means you have a lot of carbon dioxide on hand, you've been exercising, you want to go towards the T state so we can unload some of our oxygen reserves, and opposite for alkalosis. And then temperature has a very strong effect. So heating it up also heads us towards the T state. And that should also make sense, right? Like as your body heat goes up because you've been exercising, it's going to cause, you're going to want to unload more oxygen because of exercise. And then, of course, carbon dioxide also affects hemoglobin saturation. So we can see this as here we are at no CO2, and then as we add, no CO2, and then as we add CO2, we're stepping across. So which is separate from just pH. If you look at those three, you can see the effect of pH going from 7.4 in pink to 7.2 in blue, holding carbon dioxide constant. But then you can go from stay at 7.2 and change from CO2 to 40 torr of CO2, and we also head in that same direction. The more carbon dioxide there is, the more you're going to want to unload your oxygen. All right. Sadly, carbon monoxide has another effect on hemoglobin. The problem is carbon monoxide has a binding constant that's 200 times stronger than that of oxygenated hemoglobin. Because of that, it basically just binds to the hemoglobin and knocks it the hell out. I used to work in Texas down there, and you guys saw my BMI map data. I had some people who were not especially healthy in some of those classes down there, and a lot of the times they were super stressed out. They would come into class, and I would walk into the building, and they'd all be outside just like sucking on cigarettes, super hardcore before a test. It's like the worst thing you could do before a test because they're basically just sucking in carbon monoxide and preventing their body's ability to transport oxygen. Yeah, carbon monoxide poisoning. Chronic exposure to carbon monoxide can kill people. I had a friend named Jeff die in a trailer from a bad heater because of carbon monoxide poisoning. All right, so here's a summary of it all. Because we have a minute, we're basically out of time. I'm not going to go through it in too much detail, but lower temperature, lower PCO2, lower 2,3-bisphosphoglycerate, and increased pH all favor the R state, and the opposite of each of those all favors the T state is the take-home from that slide. That's just a summary of everything I talked about on one slide. We're not going to worry about carbon dioxide transport, and then don't smoke. Don't vape. Don't do that. You guys should all know that. All right. Thank you very much.